When I came back from that 7-month deployment in Okinawa, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the good kind, like the warm hush of a Sunday morning with coffee and no obligations. No, this was the kind of silence that settles in a house like dust in a room no one's walked into for weeks. The kind that suggests something's been moved, rearranged. Carolyn met me at the base gate wearing that overwashed McDonald's uniform and a smile that looked a few shades too rehearsed. We'd been on shaky ground before I left. Distance does that to a relationship, even if you pretend it won't, but she'd been writing letters, talking to my mother, playing house with my family like a dutiful partner. The kind of thing that makes a guy think maybe, just maybe, things back home were holding together better than expected. Except, of course, for my brother. Jake. My younger brother. My personal curse wrapped in a lazy grin and 1,000 bad decisions. The kind of guy who'd stir drama just to see if he could watch it burn from the porch with a beer in hand. Ever since we were kids, he had a talent for slipping under people's skin and lighting fuses. While I was deployed, he started checking in on Carolyn a little too often. Helping with her car. Helping with the groceries. Helping with whatever else she conveniently couldn't manage without a man around. I saw the text threads, stuff I wasn't supposed to see. Thanks for the help, I owe you big time, with too many emojis. Don't know what I'd do without you. One message even said, wish Sam wasn't always so far away. That one made something in my jaw crack. But I came home like I was supposed to. I unpacked my gear, shelved the combat boots, tried to slide back into civilian normal like I hadn't spent months running drills and dodging politics overseas. I wasn't even back a full day when Carolyn dropped the bomb. We were standing in the kitchen, me still jet-lagged, her fidgeting with a chipped coffee mug, when she blurted it out. I'm pregnant. Just like that. No preamble. No context. Just a loaded sentence lobbed into the middle of the room like a grenade. My first instinct was to feel happy, stupidly happy. I mean, we'd talked about kids before, though never seriously. But there was something off in the way she said it. No sparkle in her eyes. No warmth. Just a flat, robotic tone like someone delivering bad news in a polite package. I asked how far along she was. She hesitated. Red flag. I did the math, her timeline was slippery. I hadn't been home in almost 8 months. But she said she was 3 months along. 3. Not 7. Not 6. Just 3. So tell me how I'm supposed to swallow that. It didn't add up unless I was some sort of biological miracle, shooting ghosts from across the Pacific. She tried to spin it. Said she'd gotten her dates confused. That it must have been later than she thought. That her cycle had been weird. I'd heard better lies from hungover privates trying to skip PT. And then there was Jake. He didn't even have the decency to keep his distance. Showed up at our place the next day with that smug smirk and an, I heard the news, like he was auditioning for the role of doting uncle. He brought diapers. Diapers. A pack of them, like it was some kind of peace offering or a trophy. Carolyn smiled too hard when he handed them over. She laughed too easily at his jokes. My fists clenched. I was back in my own house, but somehow, I felt like a guest at a party I wasn't invited to. I started noticing more, how she looked at him when she thought I wasn't paying attention. How he called her, Caro, like he'd earned some nickname privileges. How my own dog wagged its tail more for him than for me. The worst part? My parents didn't seem surprised when I told them the baby wasn't mine. My mother gave me that tight-lipped, church lady kind of pity. My father just sighed like he'd been expecting the whole mess. Jake always had a way of getting himself into trouble, was all he said. Like this wasn't betrayal. Like this was just another Tuesday. I didn't explode. Not right away. I held it in. I started watching everything. Every glance. Every word. Every whisper between them when they thought I wasn't listening. I collected receipts, phone logs, patterns. Because when you've been trained to spot landmines, you learn to tread quiet and gather intel before stepping down. Too often Jake showed up uninvited, walking in like he lived there, arms full of grocery bags or some second-hand baby toy he picked up on the way. Carolyn would smile that polite hostess smile, always a little too bright, a little too practiced, like she wasn't just my wife but a woman auditioning for something behind my back. I tried to be firm without setting fire to the family bridge. I told him we had it handled, thanked him for caring, but reminded him it was our home, our future, our kid. He'd just grin, shrug like it was no big deal, and say, "Just trying to help, man. I am the uncle, right?" The way he said it made my skin crawl, but I had no proof, and confronting someone without evidence is a fast way to get labeled the problem. Carolyn never backed me up either. She'd make excuses. Jake was being supportive. Jake was stepping up. Jake had free time. Jake was just lonely. But support doesn't show up 5 days a week with a key he shouldn't have. My parents, of course, acted like nothing was strange. My mother cooed over the ultrasound pictures. My father asked Jake to help him fix the back fence one weekend and said, "Good to have the family together again." That line nearly made me drop my coffee. I watched Carolyn more than I spoke. She started nesting harder than I thought possible. Washing the same baby clothes twice. Rearranging the nursery furniture 3 times in a week. Jake was always involved, moving the crib, mounting the baby camera, offering to paint. I told him to leave the painting to me. He showed up the next morning with a paint roller and said he'd already started. I stared at the half-finished wall, my fists clenched. He was making himself a fixture in my life, one quiet boundary-crossing step at a time. Then came the day we all visited my parents. It was supposed to be a normal dinner, Carolyn and me, Jake already there as usual, and Paul, my older cousin, down from Seattle. Paul had always been a straight shooter, the kind of guy who could detect a lie before it even left someone's lips. He worked in logistics, ran a warehouse with 80 employees, and had no patience for drama. We were all in the living room. My mother setting out desserts. My father watching a rerun of some war documentary. Carolyn disappeared into the hallway with Jake. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd gotten used to little disappearances, low voices. But Paul was sitting near the hallway entrance, halfway reading a magazine, when he suddenly stood up like he'd been hit by an invisible wave. He turned, pale, his eyebrows drawn together like he was trying to recalibrate the conversation he just stumbled into. I saw his jaw tighten. He said my name once, then louder. Carolyn and Jake reappeared a few seconds later, both looking like students caught sneaking out of detention. Paul stared at them both, then turned to Carolyn and asked her something so direct I almost dropped the plate in my hand. Her face turned white. Jake swallowed and looked at the floor. And right there, in front of 3 generations of family photos, Paul repeated what he'd just overheard. Carolyn had whispered to Jake that it was time to tell Paul the baby wasn't mine. Not Paul as in the cousin. Paul as in the man who wasn't supposed to know. Paul, who they assumed was still in the kitchen or flipping through TV channels. But Paul had been close enough to hear every single word, including Carolyn's urgent whisper and Jake's quiet, "Not now." Paul didn't keep his voice down. His words carried straight through the house. My mother dropped a spoon in the sink. My father looked up, confused. I stood still, not because I didn't understand, but because I did. Every puzzle piece clicked. Jake, the ever-helpful visitor. The strange familiarity. The way Carolyn glowed when he walked in. The way she stopped flinching when I mentioned the baby's name but stiffened when Jake gave his input. All of it. Everything I'd let slide came crashing back in one cold, quiet realization. I didn't need a DNA test. I could see the answer in the way Jake avoided my eyes, in the way Carolyn instinctively moved closer to him when the truth cracked open the floor beneath us. But I didn't react. Not yet. Because a man learns in the military that timing is everything. That reacting too fast is how you lose control. That sometimes silence speaks louder than fury. I turned away slowly and looked at the mantel. The framed photo of our wedding day suddenly looked like a joke. Carolyn in white, smiling like she was sure of the world. Jake in the background, wearing a too-tight tie, standing with his hands clasped like a choir boy. My stomach twisted at the memory. That was the same night he'd offered to walk her to the car after the reception. I remember it now. The look he gave her then, and the look she gave back. At the time I thought it was gratitude. Now I know it was something else. Something private. Something rehearsed. And Paul, bless him, looked from me to them and said he was sorry, but he thought I deserved to know. Carolyn tried to speak. Jake cleared his throat, and my father finally stood up. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about everything I'd done for her. For us. I'd sent money home. Paid off her car. Missed birthdays and holidays to stay stationed where they needed me. And the whole time, she'd been planning a future with the man I used to call my brother. I stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. And then I said one thing. One sentence. Calm. Steady. Because what came next would require all the clarity in the world. The day after the truth came out, I filed the paperwork without hesitation. I drove straight from my cousin's place to the courthouse, still in the same shirt from the night before, sleeves rolled, jaw clenched, walking with the kind of deliberate calm that makes people step out of your way. The woman at the filing counter didn't ask questions. I handed over the signed documents, paid the fee, and stared at the black ink where it said irreconcilable differences like it wasn't the understatement of the century. When I got home, Carolyn was in the kitchen packing up a few things like she expected to make a soft exit, like maybe we'd have some drawn-out conversation about co-parenting or shared memories, but I told her plain and simple that she needed to leave. She didn't fight. Not really. She cried a bit. Tried to talk about how complicated it was. How things hadn't meant to go this far. But I didn't owe her a debriefing. She stood in the doorway with her overnight bag, keys in hand, trying to buy time with hesitation. That's when the knock came. My parents. Of course. Word had traveled fast, and not just through whispers. My mother came in like a breeze through a cracked window, soft voice, hands folded like she'd walked into church. My father followed, more serious, eyes already scanning the damage, like he was inspecting the scene of a wreck and trying to understand how it all went so wrong. I told them she was leaving. That I'd filed. That this chapter was over. My mother's expression collapsed. She shook her head and said that wasn't right. That the child wasn't at fault. That no matter what happened between the adults, this baby deserved stability and kindness. My father added that family doesn't just discard each other in hard times. That it wasn't about forgiveness, it was about responsibility. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. I told them plainly that the child wasn't mine. That the one responsible for Carolyn's situation was their other son. That I'd done my part and had nothing left to give to something built on deceit. They stood there silent for a moment, as if they'd hoped I was wrong. As if maybe this whole mess could still be spun into a misunderstanding. But I held their gaze. I watched the moment they realized I wasn't going to bend. Carolyn shifted, eyes darting between all of us. She asked if she could stay somewhere until things settled. I laughed, dry, humorless, and told her she could ask the father of her child, not the man she betrayed. My mother, bless her soft heart, said she would stay with them for now. Said it wasn't fair to toss a pregnant woman into the street. What she didn't say, but I knew, was that Jake still lived there. That she was bringing Carolyn right to him. Right into the same house where they'd probably sneaked around before. Now they wouldn't have to sneak. Carolyn nodded like she understood, but there was no apology in her face. No regret. Just exhaustion. She left quietly, got in my mother's car, and disappeared down the street. I locked the door behind them and turned off the lights. The house felt foreign after that. The nursery door stayed shut. I unplugged the baby monitor. Tossed the unopened diapers in the garage. I contacted a lawyer the next morning and gave him everything: dates, timelines, the texts I'd found, the fact that we hadn't been intimate in over 9 months. He said a paternity test wouldn't even be necessary, considering the documented evidence and my deployment timeline. Still, I wanted it. Needed it on record. I wanted every detail laid out so cleanly that no judge could mistake the facts. Jake, meanwhile, was silent. I hadn't heard from him since the night Paul called him out in front of everyone. I figured he was holed up in his room at our parents' place, trying to spin his side of the story, trying to charm his way back into being the golden boy. Our parents wouldn't hold him accountable. They never had. Jake always landed softly no matter how far he fell. I, on the other hand, spent my days preparing for court. Dividing assets. Making a list of what needed to be separated, down to the coffee machine and the security deposit box. The lawyer said Carolyn hadn't filed anything yet, which was suspicious. She wasn't contesting the divorce. She wasn't even asking for support. But I knew her silence wasn't peace. It was planning. And the fact that Jake had vanished from public view told me they were working on something. Building a case. Maybe trying to flip the narrative before the hearing. Maybe worse. The final piece fell into place when my lawyer called to say a subpoena had just come in from Carolyn's side. They wanted to see financial records. Not from our shared account, but mine. Separate. From before we were married. My gut went cold. I hadn't thought she'd be so bold. Or so desperate. But desperate people cornered by the truth rarely walk away quietly. And I had a feeling Carolyn and Jake weren't finished trying to rewrite the ending. I found out they weren't just aiming for half of what we'd built together, they were aiming for everything. Carolyn and Jake had somehow gotten it into their heads that they deserved not only a slice of the shared property but also the private savings I'd built long before I ever met her. Savings that existed in an account under my name only. Funds I'd accumulated through years of military deployments, hazard pay, cost of living sacrifices, and a whole lot of nights skipping restaurants so I could throw an extra $50 into that account. The only person I had ever mentioned those savings to was my mother. Once. Years ago. Back when she asked why I never spent much on myself. I told her I was building something for the future. I never thought she'd say a word about it. But mothers can't always help themselves, especially when they think they're softening the path for someone they care about. I don't know exactly how Carolyn learned about that money. Maybe she overheard something. Maybe my mother let it slip during one of her gentle lectures about family unity. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done. The subpoena was clear. They were trying to claim those savings as community property, citing contributions Carolyn made in the form of emotional labor and support. That was the moment I snapped. I drove to my parents' house without calling ahead, fists clenched so tight I left nail marks in my palms. I didn't care who was home. I walked straight into the living room and saw Jake and Carolyn sitting there like it was just another afternoon. My father looked up from the recliner. My mother came out of the kitchen, already sensing something was wrong. I didn't hold back. I raised my voice and laid it all out. That the savings were mine. That Carolyn hadn't earned a dime of it. That she hadn't worked a single job after the wedding and had never contributed financially, not even once. That she didn't pay a cent toward the mortgage. That the furniture, appliances, electronics, every last bit of it, had been paid for by me. My mother tried to calm me down, said we could talk it through, said there had to be a misunderstanding. But I wasn't hearing any of it. I looked at my father and told him I was done with the pretense. That Jake wasn't a confused young man or a well-meaning brother. He was a liar who had wormed his way into my marriage, fathered a child behind my back, and now had the nerve to try and rob me in broad daylight. My father looked stunned, but said nothing. And then Jake stood up. Calm. Hands raised like he was innocent. Told me to relax. Said it didn't have to be this ugly. That maybe if I'd just listened earlier, none of this would have happened. And that's when I hit him. My fist met his face with a sound I'll never forget, sharp and final like the snap of a dry branch. He stumbled back, grabbing his mouth, eyes wide with shock. My mother screamed. My father tried to separate us. Carolyn stood there frozen. I stepped back, breathing hard. Jake didn't even fight back. Maybe he knew he deserved it. Maybe he thought it would help his case if I looked like the unstable one. The police arrived 10 minutes later. A neighbor must have heard the shouting. I didn't resist. I explained everything, calmly, plainly. Jake refused to press charges, said it was a family disagreement. Still, the officers had to follow protocol. They took me in for disturbing the peace and simple battery. I paid the fine that same night. No overnight stay. No mugshot. Just a signature, a receipt, and a burning desire to make sure that woman and her co-conspirator didn't get a single penny more than they deserved. Back at home, I doubled down. I reviewed every financial document I had, every receipt, every mortgage statement, every insurance form. Everything was in my name. Not a single utility or payment had ever been processed from her account. She didn't even have an account. I made sure the lawyer had it all. I wasn't going to let pity, manipulation, or some courtroom sob story undo what I'd built. Around that time, the baby was born. A girl. I didn't go to the hospital. I didn't send flowers. Jake's name went on the birth certificate. But a few weeks later, word got back to me that the child had begun to develop health complications. It was serious. Something genetic. Some kind of immune system disorder that required long-term care and expensive medication. My mother called me about it, said the baby was innocent. That regardless of what happened, she was still blood. I said she wasn't mine. I had no legal or biological connection to her. That it was on Jake now. The way it always should have been. The court date finally came. I sat there while Carolyn tried to play the devoted mother wronged by a cold, unfeeling husband. Jake didn't even show up. Just her and her lawyer spinning stories about emotional abuse, neglect, promises I never fulfilled. But they had no evidence. No timeline that held water. My lawyer presented the records, financial, logistical, emotional. Every deployment. Every payment. Every message I'd saved. The judge asked a few questions. Then ruled in my favor. Divorce granted. No spousal support. No division of property. The house, the savings, the car, the accounts, all remained with me. Carolyn walked out without so much as a used blender to her name. I watched her leave the courtroom, her expression blank, holding a manila envelope full of nothing useful. The world she thought she could manipulate had caved in on her. She'd gambled on deception, backed by a brother who had no idea what real responsibility looked like. And now she was walking into a future with a child who needed more care than she was ready for, and a partner whose track record for commitment didn't go much beyond casual visits and charm. A few weeks after the court ruling, just as I was starting to feel the dust finally settling around my life, the call came in from HQ about a new business trip. A project in Alaska, 2 months minimum, maybe more depending on weather and progress. I said yes before the briefing even finished. I didn't need time to think about it. Packing a bag and leaving town sounded more like a gift than an obligation. There was nothing left for me in that house except echoes, and nothing in that town but people with long memories and short opinions. I started preparing right away, pulling files, confirming flights, tightening up loose ends, feeling more focused than I had in months. A few days before departure, my parents showed up unannounced. They hadn't been to my place since the blow-up with Jake. I opened the door to see my mother holding a folder and my father looking like he'd aged 5 years in the last 2. She started in immediately, voice soft, trying to appeal to my empathy. Said the baby had taken a turn, the sickness had gotten worse, and they needed help, specifically, financial help. There was some new doctor, some rare treatment option, but it wasn't covered under public insurance. My father spoke next, saying they'd already given what they could, that Jake was doing all he could, but he was stretched thin. He said it wasn't fair to let a child suffer just because of adult mistakes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just stepped back, said I had a flight in 48 hours, and that whatever Jake and Carolyn had brought into the world was their load to carry, not mine. I reminded them that every dollar I had was earned without a cent from either of them, and that I'd already paid more than enough in peace of mind. Then I closed the door before either of them could say another word. That night, the calls started. A cousin from Michigan. An aunt I hadn't heard from since high school. All of them calling to guilt me, to sway me, to paint me as the one abandoning a helpless child. They'd all heard the same story, that I had the means to help but was refusing out of pride or bitterness. Not one of them called when I was sitting in court alone. Not one of them offered me support when my marriage collapsed in front of me. But now that a child, not mine by blood or law, was sick, I was supposed to be the rescuer. I blocked half their numbers within the first 3 days. Alaska came quickly, a welcome blur of flight connections and cold air and hard work. Long days, frozen fingers, mechanical problems that required actual solutions instead of emotional gymnastics. I kept my head down, made progress on the job, and felt more like myself than I had in years. I didn't think about Carolyn. I didn't think about Jake. I especially didn't think about the baby. Then one evening, back in my temporary rental after a 12-hour shift, I found a letter slid under my door. Not a call, not an email, an actual letter. I opened it slowly, immediately recognizing my mother's handwriting. She wrote that the child had one final chance. A specialist in Boston had agreed to review the case. The surgery was delicate, expensive, but it offered real hope. She said there was a fund set up, but they were short. She asked me, begged me, to consider contributing. Just something, anything. She ended the letter by saying that even if I couldn't do it for Carolyn, maybe I could do it for the child. I read it twice, then a third time, sitting there with snow tapping against the window. But I felt nothing. No guilt. No spark of obligation. Just the calm certainty that I would not be pulled back in. I had made my peace. I had paid enough. I placed the letter in the trash and went back to my laptop, opened the specs for the next day's work, and poured myself a coffee. The weather forecast warned of an incoming storm. Flights might get grounded. Work might get delayed. But as I stared out at the frozen trees, something shifted in my gut, not regret, not second-guessing, but a quiet awareness that something else was coming. Something I hadn't been told yet.